A man can spend his entire life protecting something he never truly possesses. He had gold buried beneath the earth. He had wealth enough to live like a king, yet he walked through life like a beggar. Every coin he earned became another chain. Every piece of gold he collected became another reason to fear loss. He did not eat better. He did not travel. He did not give. He did not enjoy the fruits of his labor. He simply watched his treasure grow. And somewhere along the path, he forgot the difference between possessing wealth and being possessed by it. Ancient warriors understood something this man never learned. Strength without discipline becomes destruction. Wealth without purpose becomes another form of bondage. And the ego that says, "I need more," can never be satisfied by having more. Then one morning, his hidden treasure disappeared. His cries shook the silence. "My gold, it's gone!" But a quiet passerby asked him one question that cut deeper than the loss itself. "Did you ever use it?" The miser said no. And suddenly, the real tragedy became clear. His money had not been stolen that morning. He had lost his life long before. There was once a man who had everything a person could spend a lifetime chasing. Land, gold, a large estate, food in abundance, clothes he could have worn every day of the year, and enough money to make his old age comfortable. Yet every morning he woke with the same question. What if I lose it? Before the sun fully rose, he was already counting. Not because he needed to spend, not because someone was demanding payment. He counted because counting made him feel safe. One coin, then another, then another. His fingers moved slowly across the pile while the room remained silent around him. Outside, birds sang from the trees. Workers moved across his estate. The smell of breakfast drifted through the house. But the man noticed none of it. His attention belonged to the money. This was how fear often enters a person's life. Not like a storm, not loudly. It arrives quietly. It convinces you that one more possession will finally make you secure. One more coin, one more piece of land, one more achievement, one more guarantee against tomorrow. And then, without noticing, you stop living for life. You begin living to protect what you have. The ancient warrior understood discipline differently. A warrior trained his body so fear would not control his actions. He trained his mind so desire would not command his spirit. He learned to possess a sword without becoming possessed by it. But this man had learned only half of the lesson. He had discipline. He could save. He could sacrifice pleasure. He could deny himself almost anything. But his discipline had no purpose. It had become attachment. And attachment, when strengthened by fear, can become a prison. The man rarely bought anything for himself. He ate simple meals. He wore old clothing. He avoided journeys. He refused comforts that his wealth could easily provide. People who saw his estate might have called him successful. People who saw his life might have called him poor. But the strangest part was this. He did not feel poor because he had little. He felt poor because he was always afraid that what he had might disappear. Modern psychology gives us a language for part of this behavior. The human mind can experience the pain of losing, something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining, something of similar value. This is sometimes described as loss aversion, and the miser had built his entire existence around it. He was no longer asking, "What can this wealth do for my life?" He was asking, "How can I make sure nothing takes it from me?" That question slowly became his master. Then one day, he made a decision. He gathered his money, all of it. He carried the heavy treasure away, from his house and into a quiet place, beyond the ordinary path. There, beneath the earth, he dug. The soil was cool beneath his hands. The sound of the shovel, breaking through the ground, echoed softly in the morning silence. He looked around. No one was watching. Satisfied, he placed his treasure into the hole. Then he covered it. Soil over gold, earth over wealth, silence over fear. He stood there for a moment, and for the first time that day he smiled. He believed he had found security, but what he had really found was a ritual. Every morning he returned. He looked around carefully. Then he dug. He uncovered the treasure. He stared at it. Sometimes he touched the gold. Sometimes he counted it. Then he buried it again. Day after day, week after week, the world continued moving. Children grew older. Seasons changed. The trees lost their leaves and grew them again. People worked. People loved. People celebrated. People mourned. Life kept moving forward, but the miser remained in the same place, standing above a hole in the ground, watching something he never used. His body was alive in the present, but his mind was always somewhere else, in tomorrow, in the possibility of loss, in imagined thieves, in imagined disasters, in imagined poverty. And that is one of the most dangerous forms of fear. Not the fear of something happening, but the fear of something possibly happening, because possibility has no boundary. You can never completely defeat it. The man could hide his gold deeper. He could build stronger walls. He could guard his estate more carefully. But the mind that believes safety comes from controlling everything. Will always find another threat, another weakness, another reason to worry, another thing to protect. His wealth had given him the ability to live freely, yet he had used that wealth to construct invisible chains. This is where the ancient path of discipline offers a different lesson. Discipline is not simply the ability to say no. It is knowing why you say no. A warrior does not train merely to suffer. He trains so that when the moment comes, he can act with clarity. A monk does not practice silence because words are evil. He practices silence so he can hear what noise is hidden. And a wise person does not save merely to accumulate. He saves so that resources can serve a purpose. The miser had confused restraint with mastery. He believed that because he could deny himself everything, he was strong. But strength is not measured by how much you can refuse. Sometimes strength is knowing what you are allowed to enjoy, knowing when to hold, knowing when to give, knowing when to spend, and most importantly, knowing when to let go. The miser knew how to hold. He knew nothing about letting go. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, he returned to his hiding place once again. The sky was turning dark. A cool wind moved through the trees. He stood over the buried treasure and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Only the sound of the wind moving through the branches. He smiled. His treasure was safe, or so he believed. A few yards away, hidden among the shadows, another man had been watching. A ditch digger. He had noticed the strange routine. The wealthy man coming alone. The secretive glances. The digging. The burial. Again and again. The ditch digger did not understand why. A wealthy man would hide something he could easily keep inside his house. But he understood one thing. The man was protecting something valuable. So he waited. He watched. He remained silent. And eventually, the secret that the miser had spent years protecting was no longer a secret. The miser believed the earth was his vault. He did not realize that the earth had become his witness. And while he continued returning to his hidden treasure, another man was slowly learning the path to it. The miser had spent his life mastering the art of possession. Soon, he would be forced to confront the one thing he had never practiced: loss. And when the treasure disappeared, he would discover that the deepest prison was never beneath the earth. It had been inside him all along. The night passed quietly. The miser slept beneath the roof of his comfortable home, believing his greatest treasure was waiting safely beneath the earth. He did not know that the earth had already been opened. Before dawn, while the world was still wrapped in darkness, the ditch digger returned. He carried a shovel. He knew exactly where to go. There was no hesitation in his steps. The place was silent except for the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. He stopped, looked around, then began to dig. The first layer of soil gave way easily, then another. His shovel struck something hard. He knelt down and cleared the dirt with his hands. There it was. The treasure, the wealth the miser had spent years protecting. The ditch digger looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. Every coin, every piece of gold, everything the miser had buried. He did not leave a note. He did not announce what he had done. He simply covered the hole again and disappeared before sunrise. The earth returned to silence. And the miser knew nothing. Hours later, he began his morning ritual. He walked toward the familiar place. His footsteps were slow. His mind was calm. He looked around as he always did. No one was there. He smiled. Then he began to dig. The shovel entered the soil. Once, twice, again, but something felt different. The earth seemed strangely empty. He dug deeper. His breathing became faster. He pushed the soil aside. Nothing. He dug again. Nothing. Then he reached the bottom. His hands moved desperately through the dirt. Still nothing. The treasure was gone. For a few seconds, he simply stared. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. Then came the realization. His entire body seemed to collapse beneath it. My gold. His voice was barely audible. He searched again. Perhaps he had made a mistake. Perhaps he had buried it somewhere else. He dug around the hole. Nothing. Then the silence broke. They've got my gold. His voice echoed through the morning. It's gone! He fell to his knees. The man who had spent years fearing the loss of his treasure was now experiencing the very disaster. His mind had rehearsed 1,000 times, but something deeper was happening. He was not merely mourning money, he was mourning the identity he had built around it. For years he had told himself, I am safe because I have gold. Now the gold was gone, and suddenly he did not know who he was without it. This is one of the strange contradictions of attachment. The tighter we wrap our identity around something, the more frightening its loss becomes. A possession begins as something we own. Then we protect it. Then we think about it. Then we organize our lives around it. And eventually, without realizing it, it begins to own us. The miser had not touched his treasure for years, yet losing it caused him unbearable pain. Why? Because value is not always determined by use. Sometimes it is determined by the meaning we attach to something. The gold had become proof of his security, proof of his success, proof that tomorrow could not defeat him. But tomorrow had arrived anyway. A passerby heard the crying and approached. He saw the miser kneeling beside the empty hole. What happened? He asked. The miser could barely speak. My treasure. He pointed toward the ground. My gold was buried here. Someone has taken it. The passerby looked at the hole. Then he looked at the man. How much did you lose? The miser named the amount. It was an enormous fortune. The passerby was stunned. You buried all that money here? Yes. And you kept it here? Yes. For how long? For years. The passerby paused. Then came the question that the miser did not expect. Did you ever use it? The miser looked away. No. The passerby waited. Not once? No. The answer fell into the silence between them, and suddenly the whole tragedy looked different. The miser had spent years protecting something he had never allowed to serve him. He had possessed wealth without experiencing its benefits. He had carried the psychological burden of ownership, without receiving the practical value of what he owned. The passerby pointed toward the empty hole. Then tell me, he said calmly, what exactly has changed in your life? The miser looked confused. What do you mean? You had money underground yesterday. You did not use it. Today there is no money underground. But if you still live exactly as you lived yesterday, what has actually changed? The miser opened his mouth. No answer came. The passerby continued. You ate the same food yesterday. Yes. You wore the same clothes. Yes. You lived in the same house. Yes. You never touched the gold. The miser lowered his head. No. Then your sorrow is not because you lost something you used. The passerby looked directly into his eyes. You are grieving something you only imagined using. Those words struck harder than an accusation, because they were true. The miser had always told himself, I can use it whenever I need it. But whenever had become years. Then years had become decades, and the future had remained a promise he never collected. This is where presence becomes essential. The human mind often lives between two places. Regret lives in the past. Anxiety lives in the future. But life itself happens only in the present. The miser had sacrificed the present for an imagined future, in which he might finally enjoy his wealth. But that future never arrived. And now the wealth was gone. His discipline had protected the treasure. But it had not protected his life. The passerby did not mock him. He did not celebrate his misfortune. He simply stood beside him in silence. Because sometimes wisdom does not need a speech. It needs a mirror. The empty hole was that mirror. For the first time, the miser was forced to look at the life he had created. A wealthy man who lived like a beggar. A man surrounded by abundance who constantly felt poor. A man who had gold beneath his feet but fear inside his heart. And perhaps the cruelest realization was this. The thief had taken his money in one morning. But the miser had been stealing from himself for years. He had stolen comfort from his own body, joy from his own days, generosity from his own hands, presence from his own mind. He had postponed life until some imaginary moment when he would finally feel safe enough to live. That moment never came. The passerby looked once more at the empty ground. Then he spoke quietly. You believed the gold was your treasure. He paused. But perhaps the real treasure was the life you could have lived. While you had it, the miser remained silent. For once, he had no argument, no calculation, no defense, only the sound of the wind moving across the empty earth. And somewhere inside that silence, the first crack appeared in the prison he had built around himself. The treasure was gone, but for the first time, the miser was beginning to see what his attachment had cost him. The miser remained beside the empty hole long after the passerby had spoken. The morning grew brighter. Birds moved through the branches. People began their daily work, while a cart rolled along the distant road. Life continued. But for the miser, everything had become still. He looked into the empty hole again. For years, that place had represented security. Now it represented something else, truth. He finally understood that the gold had never given him peace. It had only given his fear something to protect. The passerby bent down and picked up a stone. He turned it slowly in his hand, then placed it inside the empty hole. "Cover this," he said. The miser stared at him. "What?" "Put the stone where your treasure used to be." The miser looked at him as though he had gone mad. "Why would I do that?" "Because you never used the treasure anyway." Silence. The words struck deeply. "If you never ate better because of it, never traveled because of it, never helped anyone with it, and never spent it on anything meaningful, then what difference will a stone make?" The miser looked down at the stone. It was worthless. Yet, in a strange way, it represented exactly what his treasure had become. Something to look at, something to protect, something that gave him the illusion of security, without giving him the experience of living. Slowly, the miser placed the stone into the hole and covered it with earth. His hands moved differently this time. There was no excitement, no pride, no relief, only awareness. For years, he had believed that the purpose of wealth was possession. Now he was beginning to understand that possession was only the beginning. Wealth without purpose is merely stored potential. A sword kept forever inside its sheath may remain beautiful, but it cannot protect anyone. Water trapped inside a sealed vessel cannot satisfy the thirsty, and money buried beneath the earth cannot improve a life. The ancient warrior understood this. His strength was not measured by the sword he possessed. It was measured by his ability to use it wisely and only when necessary. That is the difference between power and mastery. Power says, "I have it." Mastery asks, "What is it for?" The miser had spent his entire life answering the first question. Now he had to face the second. What was his wealth for? The answer did not come immediately. He had spent decades collecting, and purpose had become unfamiliar. He had forgotten that money could buy food for someone hungry, medicine for someone sick, education for a child, a home for a family, or comfort for those he loved. He had mistaken spending for weakness. But wise spending is not weakness. Generosity is not weakness. Neither is wise enjoyment of life. The real discipline is knowing the difference between indulgence and meaningful use. The miser had been disciplined, but his discipline had served fear instead of purpose. He controlled his spending, yet never controlled his attachment. And without awareness, even discipline can become another prison. The passerby stood quietly beside him. Then he spoke. "Your wealth was supposed to serve your life. Instead, you spent your life serving your wealth." The miser said nothing. Those words were difficult because they were true. He looked toward his estate. For the first time, he noticed what had always been there. Workers moving across the fields. Trees swaying in the morning wind. Sunlight touching the roofs. The distant sound of voices. The simple movement of life. None of it had changed. Only his attention had changed. That is the beginning of presence. You do not always need to change the world. Sometimes you need to change the way you stand inside it. The miser had spent years living in fear of tomorrow. Now he had been forced back into today. He could not recover his stolen gold. He could not rewrite the years he had wasted. But he still possessed something more important. Choice. And choice is where transformation begins. He could return home, rebuild his treasure, find another hiding place, and repeat the same cycle. Or he could walk a different path. A path where money became a tool rather than a master. A path where discipline served purpose. A path where silence created clarity rather than fear. A path where possessions remained possessions and his spirit remained free. This is the deeper lesson of his story. The problem was never that he had money. The problem was that money had become the center of his identity. The ego whispered, "More will make you safe. Fear answered, "But what if you lose it?" So he collected more, then feared more, then collected more again. A perfect circle, a prison with no walls, until one day, the walls disappeared because the treasure disappeared. And in that emptiness, he finally saw the door. The warrior does not seek to own everything. He seeks mastery over himself. The Zen practitioner does not cling to every thought. He watches thoughts arise and pass. The Stoic does not demand control over everything. He learns to distinguish between what belongs to his power and what does not. The miser, standing beside that stone, was finally beginning to understand. You can lose money and still remain wealthy in spirit. You can lose possessions and still possess yourself. You can lose what you thought you needed and discover that you were never truly free while you had it. The sun climbed higher. The miser took one final look at the place where his treasure had been. Then he turned away, not because the loss no longer mattered, but because he finally understood that his life could not be buried with his gold. He walked toward his home. This time he noticed the road. He noticed the sky. He noticed the people around him. He was still wealthy, but for the first time he was beginning to become free. True wealth is not measured by how much a person can keep hidden beneath the earth. It is measured by how wisely they use what has been placed in their hands. True strength is not the ability to hold on forever. It is the courage to release what controls you. The miser had lost his treasure. But beneath that loss, something far more valuable had begun to awaken. Presence. From presence came discipline. From discipline came clarity. From clarity came freedom. That is the path. And every path toward mastery begins with one difficult realization. What you own should serve your life, not become the life you serve.